to the first of our 4 online workshops entitled Global Black Women's Writing, Experimental Subjectivities. I'm Pelagia Goulimari, academic co-lead of the Intersectional Humanities Research Program at the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities Torch. These 4 workshops pose a guiding question: in what inventive ways do Black women writers for Britain, the Caribbean, Africa, and the US experiment with the representation of Black subjectivity? The workshops suggest an answer. Through narrative form and stylistic innovations, Black women writers reshape the formal structure of their texts and pioneer different types of different styles of narration in their efforts to depict the lives, histories, and subjective realities of racialized subjects. The revolutionary content and stylistic innovations deployed by contemporary Black women writers enable readers to confront and even change their fixed ideas about racialized subjects. 14 wonderful speakers will be presenting their research, 3 of them today. Hello, everyone. Presentations will last for about 15 minutes and will be followed by discussion. Our speakers would love to hear from you, receive questions from you. Please type your questions at the bottom of your screen. If you click the Q&A box, please. And workshops are convened by myself, by Sheldon George of Simmons University, and Jean Wyatt of Occidental College. All presentations are being revised toward an edited collection edited by Sheldon and Jean, forthcoming from Bloomsbury for the Global Women Writing series. Thank you very much for contributing to the process of revision with your participation and your questions to come. Many thanks to Intersectional Humanities, many thanks to Torch who are helping us today. And thank you, Sheldon and Jean, for moderating the workshops. Over to you, Sheldon.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Pelagia, and thank you also for hosting this event along with Torch. I'm Sheldon George, and as Pelagia said, Jean and I are editing this collection, Experimental Subjectivities, which will compile the papers that are included in these presentations. Most of the presenters have gone through one draft of review, so there is still time for further edits. So as Pelagia said, we encourage your questions. So today I will introduce each of the panelists directly before they speak, and then we'll save questions for the end. So let's start with Jean Wyatt. Jean Wyatt's latest book is Love and Narrative Form in Toni Morrison's later novels. It was published in 2017 by Georgia Press, and it was awarded the Toni Morrison Society Book Prize in 2018. Jean Wyatt is co-editor with Sheldon George of a collection of essays titled Reading Contemporary Black, British, and African American Women Writers, Race, Ethics, Narrative Form from 2020. Most recently, she has written 3 essays on Helen Oyeyemi, one titled Reinventing the Gothic in Oyeyemi's White is for Witching, Maternal Ethics and Racial Politics, and a second titled Dublin and Disassociation in Nella Larson's Passing, and Helen Oyeyemi's Boy, Snow, Bird, and also the third, Mirror, Mirror, the Visual Economy of Race in Helen Oyeyemi's Boy, Snow, Bird, which came out in Angelica. She is professor of English at Occidental College. I give you Jean Wyatt.
Thank you, Sheldon. So I just want to remind everybody that the title and theme of our collection of essays is Experimental Subjectivities. And I thought maybe I would start with some observations on Oyeyemi's The Icarus Girl. The title of my talk is Disorienting Subjectivity in Helen Oyeyemi's The Icarus Girl, Toward Yoruba Understandings of Embodiment, Reincarnation, and Place. In Helen Oyeyemi's The Icarus Girl, the protagonist Jess has an uncertain relationship to her own subjectivity. Her already tentative and fragile sense of self is threatened by the instability of the spaces she inhabits. In her family's house, ceilings change places with floors, rooms become empty or too full, houses become mere shadows. The disintegration of these spatial boundaries troubles not only Jess's relation to her surroundings, but also her sense of her own embodied subjectivity. The Icarus Girl invents a number of narrative techniques to make an empathic reader feel some of the destabilizing force of shifting and chaotic spaces, which Jess feels. In particular, I argue, the text assaults a number of the assumptions about subjectivity that a Western reader brings to the text. That subjectivity is bounded by the borders of the body, that it is separate and distinct from other persons, and that it is subject to the limits of time and death. This disassembly of conventional Western notions of subjectivity makes way for a new narrative space in the last part of the novel, where Oyeyemi dramatizes a different notion of subjectivity inspired by Yoruba notions of twins, death and life, and reincarnation. The combination of horror and Yoruba cultural materials makes the Icarus Girl an early example of what Helen Cousins has identified as a new genre in contemporary Black British women's writing, which she calls the Yoruba Gothic. We can look at the character Tilly Tilly as emblematic of the Yoruba Gothic. I just need to give you some details from the plot. Jess, the protagonist and focalizer of the novel, is 8 years old. She is a solitary mixed race girl who is much bullied at school, where she has no friends. Near the beginning of the novel, she goes with her Nigerian mother and British father to visit her mother's family in Nigeria. There, in an abandoned building on her grandfather's compound, she encounters a person that she will come to see as her one friend, Tilly Tilly. Tilly is Jess's age and height and dresses in schoolgirl clothes like Jess. On this first meeting, Tilly Tilly repeats everything Jess says, mimicking exactly Jess's intonations. She adds no words of her own. Thus, Tilly Tilly appears at first to be a double of Jess, a Gothic doppelganger familiar from British literary tradition. But the development of Tilly Tilly pushes us past a traditional reading of the British Gothic double toward a Yoruba world of meanings, which can aid us to understand who or what Tilly is. Tilly is such a compelling and enigmatic character that she threatens to take up a lot of space in this talk, just as she takes up a lot of space in the novel. But this is Jess's story. And my focus on the Yoruba Gothic centers not on Tilly Tilly, but on the ways that Oyeyemi reinvents Gothic techniques to instill fear and even horror in the character Jess, but also in the reader who identifies with her. One technique is to upend spatial relations. The spaces of Jess's everyday world shift and change in alarming ways. Her bedroom in the family home in London has been her safe space, but once Tilly Tilly comes into her life, Jeff feels confused by the bedroom's changing dimensions. As she enters her bedroom, quote, Jess felt disoriented, as if she was about to fall off the floor and land on the ceiling, end quote. Ceiling and floor trade places, and Jess appropriately, quote, felt disoriented, end quote. Indeed, her disorientation makes it difficult for her to move. She wants to touch a familiar object in order to reorient herself, to convince herself that her room was not escaping her. but she finds herself unable to move toward the object, as if the confusion of up and down in the room has so damaged her connection to the surrounding space that she cannot move purposely through space toward her own objectives. To take just one more example of a familiar space becoming strange, one evening, Jess's parents go out, leaving her with a babysitter. They hear a sudden click and then a bang in an upstairs room. Both the babysitter and Jess are frightened. For Jess, fear radically changes the contours of the family home. Quote, the house had become a shadowy, empty space where people could come in and out if they wanted, touch things, lurk, end quote. The boundary between inside and outside disappears. The house, porous and flimsy, opens up to anyone with evil intent. The rooms and walls in Jess's house lose substantiality. The rooms and walls in Jess's house lose substantiality altogether to become shadows, incapable of holding and protecting the child within. The spatial dislocations that Jess experiences challenge her already tentative sense of self. The novel shows us again and again how one's sense of identity, one's grasp of who one is, depends on the stability of the spaces within which we move. I think we can draw some larger conclusions from the repeated scenes of radical disorientation. Subjects become aware of their embodiment through their relations with their concrete surroundings. And the experience of embodiment, it defines the scope and boundaries of their subjectivity. When the sense of embodiment is threatened by the loss of one's active relations with the space around, one's consciousness of one's own subjectivity and agency can be threatened too. How disturbing this may be to a reader depends on a reader's habits of distancing or identifying with a central character. Each reader's response will be different, but the novel does assault a reader's taken for granted assumptions about the stability of the physical structures through which the reader moves, and the insight that a secure identity is tightly linked to the stability of one's familiar spaces may hit a reader at the level of the body. As walls and rooms collapse or expand or lose their substance to become mere shadows, a reader may feel dizzy or off balance or even disoriented in relation to her own surroundings. And there's a subtitle for the second part: Reinventing Embodiment, Reincarnation, and Space. If the first 2/3 of the Icarus Girl disturb settled Western notions of embodied subjectivity, the final third of the novel suggests alternative ways of figuring subjectivity. Here, Yoruba understandings of twins and life and death infuse Oyeyemi's representation of a different kind of subjectivity. Because of time constraints, I cannot include many of the Yoruba themes in this last part of the novel. For example, the important functions of twins. I will focus more narrowly on the novel's reinvention of embodiment, subjectivity, and space. This concluding part of the novel is so enigmatic, filled with new images and relationships, and the meaning of events is so elusive that it has not garnered much critical attention. When aligned with Yoruba cultural beliefs, though, these pages reveal a series of important changes in the relation between Jess and Tilly Tilly, and they require a rethinking of embodied subjectivity. I suggest that it is difficult to understand even the plot in these culminating pages, what exactly is going on here, without reference to Yoruba belief systems. As Jess's 9th birthday approaches, Jess announces, quote, "I want to go to Nigeria for my birthday," end quote. This is a turnabout for Jess, who has until now resisted going to Nigeria. Its source is her present fear of Tilly Tilly's increasingly destructive interventions in Jess's life. Quote, "Jess had a feeling that her grandfather would know how to make Tilly Tilly stop," end quote. As Jess seems to acknowledge here, her Nigerian grandfather acts and speaks from a perspective deeply embedded in Yoruba ways of thinking and acting. He alone, she thinks, may be able to make Tilly Tilly go away. In Nigeria, during the preparations for Jess's birthday party, Tilly Tilly appears, but as always, she appears only to Jess. Throughout the narrative, Tilly's attitudes toward Jess have been unclear. Is she a liberating influence on Jess or a destructive one? Is she a good friend, as Jess keeps hoping she is? Or is she a malign force bringing disorder and destruction? What are her motivations? These become clearer in the few sentences that she speaks to Jess when she appears on the occasion of Jess's 99th birthday. She says to Jess, time to swap. I did my share. I got everyone you wanted me to. I want to be alive too. To unpack the implications of Tilly's terse comments, we need to rehearse Yoruba beliefs about the cycle of life and death. In Yoruba thinking, reincarnation is a possibility. When someone dies, the soul leaves the body, but it goes on existing in a dematerialized condition in the spirit realm. And that state is not final either, for a dead spirit has the possibility of returning to a new earthly life, reincarnated in the body of a baby born into the same family line. Oyeyemi does not just inscribe Yoruba belief systems into her text, of course. Her imagination goes to work on them, so that what we are reading is the product of Oyeyemi's reimagining of Yoruba cultural themes. In particular, Oyeyemi seems here at the end to ask a new question of the spirit world. What would a dead soul want? And more specifically, what would a dead soul want of the living? Let us take another look at Tilly's words to Jess. I'm just going to repeat what I said before. Time to swap. I did my share. I got everyone you wanted me to. I want to be alive too. For the first time, Tilly speaks her desire. I want to be alive. Two important things become clear here. First, Tilly is not a young girl about the same age as Jess, but a dead soul, since she says, I want to be alive. And what she wants, for what else would a dead soul long for, is to be alive again. And her other phrase, time to swap, exposes the desire that drives her friendship with Jess. She wants to swap, to exchange places with Jess. She wants to inhabit a human body so that she can live again. Tilly does not explain this, of course. She just says, time to swap. By changing the traditional belief that a dead soul has to wait till a new baby of its own family line is born in order to be reincarnated, Oyeyemi endows her character Tilly with a burning desire to find a human body to occupy in order to live. And the body nearest to her, with whom she has assiduously cultivated intimacy, is Jess's. Immediately after Tilly's articulation of what she wants, Jess finds herself falling and falling with Tilly and through black, empty space. Tilly, quote, lands somewhere safely, end quote. But Jess herself keeps on flying. Quote, she had shed her body as if it were some shell the sea roars through. This is a crucial sentence, but it is easily overlooked. It is crucial because Jess is now outside her body. Meanwhile, the birthday party proceeds, but Jess is not there. Rather, Jess's body is there, but it is occupied by Tilly. The text does not tell us this directly or indirectly. Oyeyemi's hallmark is enigma. There's plenty of enigma in this scene. But there are a number of hints. Jess, meaning the false Jess, Tilly and Jess's body, suddenly speaks perfect Yoruba, although Jess was only beginning to learn the language. And this Jess, the false Jess, performs the wild exuberance of an 8-year-old child enjoying her own birthday party, but it is a performance at odds with Jess's typical reticence and timidity. Meanwhile, where is Jess? Her spirit is wandering unhoused in a territory called, quote, the bush, a wilderness of the mind. This is the spirit realm where after death, quote, the soul is believed to live on in a dematerialized state, end quote. Here Jess meets her dead twin sister, Fern, and the recovery of her sister gives her strength to return to the human world of the living in search of Tilly. Meanwhile, there has been an automobile accident which leaves Jess's body, which is still occupied by Tilly Tilly, in a coma. Gathering strength, Jess returns to the hospital, to the human world, and fights Tilly Tilly for possession of Jess's body. This fight takes place inside Jess's body. And here I want to screen share. So this fight takes place inside Jess's body. It begins with the first quote here. Jess hopped, skipped, jumped into Tilly Tilly's unyielding flesh as Tilly clawed at Jess's presence. It hurt them both burningly, back into herself. This battle over possession occurs within Jess's body, where Tilly Tilly claws at Jess, and both are hurt burningly by the injuries of two people crammed into one body. Who wins? It seems to be Jess, for the text says she jumped back into herself to take possession of her body. But the next and final sentence of the novel reinstates enigma, and I'm going to screen share again because I'd like you to see this last sentence of the novel. So the second quote, Jessamine Harrison woke up and up and up. And that's the end. If the first clause stood alone, Jessamine Harrison woke up, it would signal a triumphant return to a body recaptured from the usurper. But the entire concluding sentence, Jessamine Harrison woke up and up and up, robs a reader of resolution and returns them to the puzzling discourse of ambiguous spaces that cannot be parsed. Up can make sense only in relation to a position in space, but there is no space provided here and therefore no way to determine spatial relations like up and down. Jess might be moving up into the earthly space of the hospital, having won the battle over her body, or she might be moving up into the spirit world of the bush. We are left, as so often in reading this novel, without moorings in an indeterminable space.
Thank you very much, Jean. I encourage everyone, if you have questions for Jean, please put them in the Q&A. We will get to the questions after all three speakers have spoken. Next, we have Jenni Ramone, who is Assistant Professor of Postcolonial and Global Literatures and a Director of the Postcolonial Studies Center at NTU, where she runs the Formations series with Bonington Gallery. Her recent publications include Postcolonial Literatures in the Local Literary Marketplace, Located Reading, and the Bloomsbury Introduction to Postcolonial Writing. She is managing editor of the Journal of Postcolonial Writing. Jenni Ramone specializes in global and postcolonial literatures and the literary marketplace. She's currently undertaking projects on global literature and gender and on representations of breastfeeding in global literature and art. I give you Jenni Ramone.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here. Hopefully you can see my shared screen now. I'm really delighted to be able to talk about The First Woman by Jennifer Nansabugha-Mukumbi, a novel that I recommend wildly to everyone I know, and a novel that was rejected 3 times over 17 years before publication. It was published in 2021 and soon after received global acclaim and literary prizes. The author attributes the early rejections to the novel's exploration of traditional Ganda feminism and folktales, its desire to convey a Ugandan reality to resist accommodating to the Western literary marketplace. Another reason might be that Chintu, Makumbi's previously published novel, tells a male-centered but still a Ugandan story, as if that intermediary step had to be taken before publishers would take a risk with a novel about Ugandan girls and women, Uganda feminism, and about breastfeeding. It's the text representation of breastfeeding that I'll focus on today, as this initially drew me to the novel, and I'm engaged in this broader project on the representation of breastfeeding in global art and literature. In The First Woman, storytelling and breastfeeding are central to identity, yet they're also dynamic, uncertain, and collaboratively defined. Breastfeeding has received insufficient attention in literary studies, but Makumbi's representation of women in extended maternal groups sheds light on the not heard and not read lactating body, as Spivak had it in 1995, which is still largely the case. Makumbi's novel does this through the representation of a community where childhood play and traditional storytelling signal a form of emergent breastfeeding, a concept that echoes emergent literacy. The novel conveys young protagonist Chirabo's gradual and manifold awareness of both the concept of motherhood, since she is, after all, initially compelled by the search for her own mother, about whom she knows nothing, and her consciousness and agency. She develops her understanding in resistant response to both Ugandan and Eurocentric views of self-definition, to create a form of subjectivity as dynamism, a term I'm using after Michelle Wright, who's written about Makumbi's Chintu. Uganda feminism, breastfeeding, and storytelling are entangled routes towards an experimental subjectivity, expressed both within the narrative as an ongoing resistant strategy and by the text, through multiple voices and overlaid timeframes, multiple locations, resistance to a straightforward post-colonial story, and defeated expectations. The result is an unfixed Black feminist subjectivity responsive to the pressures enacted upon it by class, colorism, maternity, inheritance, and economics. The resulting text takes up some of the opportunities that Suzanne Scaife has identified as common to Black British women's experimental writing, including spaces of open-endedness and resistance to an easy route to meaning. What could be simpler than the premise of this novel, a girl's search for her absent mother? Despite this clearly identified quest narrative, though, a straightforward resolution is resisted in favour of a story where Chirabo is still becoming aware of her meaning and potential, and of what a motherhood role can be at the book's end. Storytelling and breastfeeding are informed by each other and are intimately connected. The first story told in the novel, how we're introduced to Chirabo, is an origin story, the story of the first woman. This first woman gave birth to twins after several daughters unwanted by the community, then buried the female twin in an anthill to avoid rejection by her husband in the village, but returned to this hidden anthill to breastfeed her child until the girl grew up. This breastfeeding story would be considered exceptional in Kristen Wilson's terms. Wilson's useful term avoids negatively stereotyping practices such as extended breastfeeding like this, or breastfeeding outside the mother and biological infant dyad. This breastfeeding first woman is exceptional in the novel too, where breastfeeding is usually a mundane activity. Chirabo's intimate association with this story, which defines her at the beginning, centre and end of the narrative, is evidence of the entangled temporalities at work. Chirabo's name means the second twin, so she and this unwanted female second twin are the same person in separate temporal and narrative spaces. The impact of entangling these histories is significant. The story is more than an instructive tale that Chirabo can recall. It becomes, through its entanglement with her everyday reality, a story that she can reshape in order to question established narratives about motherhood and daughterhood and about female subjectivity. To foreground the novel with the story of an exceptional, even fantastical maternal experience undertaken as resistance implies that in The First Woman, Black women's subjectivity is a relationship between history, storytelling, and breastfeeding. Stories are critical, Nsuta insists. Telling them, and telling them the right way, is a powerful means of retaining agency, since the minute we fall silent, someone will fill the silence for us. Ganda stories claim that women are from water and men from land, a myth perpetuated to prevent women from inheriting. The women from water in those ancient stories are enticing. I like Namasi, I like that I came out of her, Kirabo reflects as a child, thinking about the mesmerizing woman who rose from the sea, then disappeared back there after producing several sons for her land-dwelling husband. Her mystery makes her appealing, and that's the danger for women retelling that story. As Nsuta clarifies, focus Kirabo, she is a story which aggravated our situation. In addition to the dispossession and migrant status of women as a result of their association with water, there's a recognition of the power of the female bodily fluids, both milk produced in breastfeeding and menstrual blood. Periods are treated as deeply problematic, and they even have their own stories. For instance, that if rainwater falls on a menstrual pad, menstrual blood will flow non-stop for the rest of your life. A lesson that leads Kirabo to reflect that there are too many liquids in women. Despite this, when she arrives at St. Teresa's School for Girls, her very heavy, painful periods are immediately acknowledged, given a medical name, dysmenorrhea, and she's given support and bed rest, activity perceived as a treat among the academic and social rigours of the school. The school is a point of focus, though the classroom is largely absent to foreground other spaces: dormitories, bathrooms, corridors, grounds, arrivals and departures in buses and cars, and medical bays. These liminal spaces offer a location from which the school's most significant function as the centre of anti-colonial and global thinking can operate. The girls are organised into houses whose names indicate the focus of life at the school: Harriet Tubman House, for instance, and Muhumuza House, named in honour of the leader of the East African Nyabingi spiritual practice, attributed to a legendary African early feminist. Ya Asantewa House is named after the warrior queen mother of Ejisu in the Ashanti Empire, now Ghana. Again, separate historical temporalities and even locations are entangled in the schoolgirls' engagement with these figures. The house rivalries are steeped in Ugandan and wider African global histories, yet at the same time, they reflect Ugandan social conventions, as Kirabo quickly learns when she's told by a housemate that we Muhumuzans are not just queens, we are anti-colonialist freedom fighters. Girls from Nakayima House are sluts. Nakayima slept with both Matiza I and Kabaliga. Listing former rulers of the territory now named Uganda with the casual insults she repeats. While stories that curtail women's power have been cultivated, there remain untold stories about women's latent potential, lying dormant until activated. The story of women's original state, a gift that affords them the powers of resistance and insight that Kirabo was taught to fear, got buried a long time ago until Nsuta dug it up. This important story, along with the story of the baby girl breastfed in secret, is activated in Kirabo through her experience and education, and together they enable her to resist the dominant narrative that would render her a migrant in her own life when she insists, I, Kirabo Namiro, refuse to be stuffed into an anthill. I have a mother, I did not come out of nowhere. It's significant that the novel opens with Kirabo telling a story and that the story is about breastfeeding. Breastfeeding in the novel signals several forms of subjectivity. While it's repeatedly and centrally invoked as part of everyday life for women, the first and the lengthiest discussion is connected with racial or ethnic identity and with bodily or somatic identity. Added to these are class and socioeconomic status, revealing intersecting subjectivities through which breastfeeding is portrayed. As children, Kirabo and Gibwa decide to try to breastfeed their baby dolls after Gibwa discovers that her breasts are starting to grow. Squeeze and see if there is milk, Kirabo insists. Gibwa successfully squeezes some milk from her nipple, but when Chirabo is encouraged to try, her friend invokes the difference between their skin colour, something Gibwa holds on to as a marker of status, in contrast to Chirabo's greater wealth, education, and social position in the community. The contrast between the white doll and Chirabo's black chest was so stark, Gibwa burst out laughing. She hooted, pointing, unable to speak until she paused to catch her breath. Their game sours as Gibwa uses her lighter skin as social advantage here, using the contrast between Chirabo's charcoaly skin and the white plastic doll to suggest that Chirabo's maternal status is in doubt. Breastfeeding is usually represented less emotionally in the text than either in this example or the story about the baby in the anthill. It is rather a regular aspect of both children's games and of motherhood routines. Several times it's articulated as a means of recalling a date or age or event through reference to the age of a child reflected by the breastfeeding pattern. The notion of maternal bonding, frequently attributed to breastfeeding globally, is absent. Breastfeeding is associated with nourishment and health in this community, where there is always another mother, in the form of an aunt, a father's second wife, or a grandparent to undertake the maternal role. There is no such thing as our mothers are different among half-siblings or step-siblings. Though mundane, breastfeeding is also expressed as the most compelling tie to motherhood. Chirabo's father was given to Nsuta to be raised at her own child, and Chirabo's surprise that her grandmother willingly handed over her baby is countered, based on the pattern and frequency of breastfeeding. After the first 6 months, she only breastfed him during the daytime, when Nsuta was at work, and Nsuta took him home in the night. Breastfeeding is somewhat rigidly practiced through these formulations. If it can be used to identify a date or to dictate the moment when the motherhood role begins and ends, this implies a standardized expectation of its extent and pattern. Failing to follow this pattern is said to result in socially unacceptable behavior. Chirabo's aunt Geyi was sexually active and openly promiscuous at a young age and left the village to marry outside the community. The community's rules and practices are things that you don't need to be told since you suckle them at your mother's teat. Geyi's refusal to adhere led people to suggest that she did not get enough breast. This example seems to reinforce patriarchally embedded codes of behaviour for women and community-sanctioned marriages. Yet, if breastfeeding is understood as a sort of grounding process, without which women like Geyi become even more dispossessed, there is also a sense that breastfeeding undercuts women's destiny to be migrants in Ganda society and is instead empowering. Once again, the first woman resists a fixed narrative in favour of a negotiable or dynamic subjectivity. The text asserts several times that the female body, and in particular its association with either sexuality or maternity, or the combined meanings of those two things, is the centre of women's power and subjectivity. In the first woman, Black women's experimental subjectivity is a relationship between history, storytelling, and maternity is almost always in the text synonymous with breastfeeding.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Now we will hear from Helen Cousins, who is a reader in post-colonial literature at Newman University, Birmingham, UK. She is published in the journals Research in African Literature and Post-Colonial Text, including co-editing an issue of African Literature Today on diaspora and return. She has also contributed chapters on African and Black British literature to various edited collections. She's published widely on the Black British author Helen Oyeyemi, including contributions to Telling It Slant, Critical Approaches to Helen Oyeyemi, and Women Writers and Experimental Narratives. Her current research focuses on metamorphosis in 21st century British women's writing. I give you Helen Cousins. And again, before Helen starts, please recall to post your questions in the Q&A chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be talking about coincidence and community in Amalata Fauna's Happiness. Not a very experimental novel in itself. I'm focusing on the sort of, to start with the idea of coincidence in this novel. So the use of narrative coincidence is a feature of Fauna's work, often commented on in discussions of her earlier novel, The Memory of Love, and in relation to happiness, which I'm discussing today. I want to argue that Fauna's use of coincidence is a successful literary device for countering a Black subjectivity of alienation that's often found in literatures of immigration. The novel begins with several apparently coincidental meetings between the two main characters, Jean and Attila, who unexpectedly bump into each other 3 times on consecutive days in different parts of London. Jean, originally from America, is a wildlife biologist now living in London and carrying out a study of the urban foxes in the city. Attila is a Ghanaian psychiatrist visiting London to attend a conference. From these meetings, the novel starts to weave together a bigger group of people associated with Jean and Attila, who are brought together with a common purpose: to find Attila's missing grandnephew. Now, it's a matter of debate what constitutes coincidence in a literary work. In her article, Poetics of Coincidence in Narrative Fiction, Hilary Dannenberg acknowledges that there's no consensus on how to define coincidence in narrative. However, she recognises that all the definitions she explores, quote, emphasise the interconnected function of coincidence, centring either on the bringing together of characters or on the creation of chains of relationship. She also says the term is sometimes used loosely as a synonym for chance and not to refer to a specific narrative plot. Dannenberg continues to note that some definitions use coincidence as, quote again, an umbrella term which allows any accident or twist of chance or fate to qualify. Now, in one review of the novel Happiness, Fauna's use of coincidence was praised, saying that it is in service to broader thematic concerns with connectivity. And I've also chosen to take a broad view of coincidence in order to emphasize the ideas of connection in the novel. For example, in the first chapter, the narrative follows a fox as it wended its way through the pedestrians early one evening. The fox runs into the theatre lobby and it's chased by 2 Yoruba security guards who later will join the team searching for Tano. On the other side of the foyer, the fox is let out by a silver man. This is a man who performs as a living statue, so he's covered in silver paint and wearing silver clothes. He will also join the search party later. The fox continues up onto a bridge where he passes Attila, who's on his way to the theatre and who's about to collide with Jean in their first meeting. Jean is following the fox. So here the narrative uses the fox to foreshadow those meetings as the fox connects a series of characters who will be brought together later in the narrative. Now, some might not find that strictly an example of narrative coincidence, and there are perhaps more conventional examples in the novel, but it does illustrate the tendency towards interconnection in the novel more generally. That connectivity counterpoints the alienation that's also illustrated and problematized in Happiness. In Fauna's work, alienation is often allied to trauma, and trauma is clearly of interest to Fauna. It features significantly in The Memory of Love, her earlier novel set in the aftermath of the Sierra Leonean War, as well as in Happiness. Fauna is concerned that the idea of trauma has proliferated to explain a cornucopia of social ills. In an essay she wrote for the Yale Review, she asks, why has the belief that suffering necessarily leads to trauma become so common? And why do some people react so angrily when anyone suggests otherwise? These ideas are discussed explicitly in Happiness during the conference in London that Attila attends. Attila expresses Fauna's point of view, I guess, telling another participant at the conference to quote, suffering and damage are not the same. Suffering does not equal damage. The part of Happiness that is often used in other critical articles to explore Fauna's view of trauma is Adama Sheriff's story. The Sheriffs are an immigrant couple from Sierra Leone living in London, and Adama has been arrested for arson, having set her own flat on fire. Adama's defence team want to argue that she's got PTSD following the sudden recent death of her husband in a motorcycle accident. For her lawyer, this is the easiest way for his client to avoid a conviction, which may lead to her being deported or imprisoned. Attila is asked by the defence team to evaluate her and confirm the PTSD diagnosis. But Attila is more interested in what Adama is most angry about. And that's how the women that she worked for, sewing their clothes, have started to cross the road to avoid talking to her since her husband died. Attila suggests that, to quote, they were avoiding her because she was bereaved. So instead of being comforted, Adama Sheriff finds herself ignored and isolated. Attila goes on to suggest that these white British women's lives are so untouched that they are terrified of the slightest hurt and so afraid of their own mortality, they would cross the road rather than confront a reminder of it. It's easier for the defence team to assume that there's something wrong with Adama than to look at the uncomfortable responses of her white neighbours. In his critique of Western models of trauma, Steph Krapps notes that dominant Western ideas consider trauma as an individual phenomenon, distracting attention from the wider social situation. Krapps suggests that by, to quote, narrowly focusing on the level of the individual psyche, one tends to leave unquestioned the conditions that enable the traumatic abuse, such as racism, amongst other institutional factors that he remembers. The assumption of the first psychiatrist to interview Adama is that the neighbour's behaviour is racist, but he fails to connect this shunning to Adama's bereavement. Even Adama fails to grasp how racism is connected to her plight, even though she's clearly discussed it with the psychiatrist. She tells Attila, you know how it is with white people. You say it's race, they tell you you're mistaken. Then they say it's because of your race when you say it's not. They always have to say the opposite. On further questioning, she admits to Attila that actually she's confused about her neighbour's behaviour. She says, I don't know what was wrong with them. It's easy to alienate and other Adama because she's black, and by othering her, the white women can ignore her humanity and her need for human comfort. Equally, because PTSD does not account for institutional trauma, the neighbour's behaviour is assumed to be irrelevant to the case. Now, in my greater discussion of alienation in the chapter that I've written for the collection, I link another narrative thread to Adama's. As mentioned already, Attila's grandnephew called Tano is missing. The circumstances of his disappearance follow his mother's arrest by immigration services when her landlord reports that she and Tano are in the UK illegally. Tano's put into care but has run away, and social services have failed to locate him. Amma, Tano's mother, explains to her uncle Attila that the landlord's report was a deliberate lie because he wanted to raise the rent, but he couldn't, as Amma has a fixed tenancy. As the tenant, Amma needs to provide proof of her right to reside, but she suggests that the landlord, to quote, probably just called whoever and said she had refused or failed to provide it. Whether or not this is a racist or just economic action on the part of the landlord, he would understand that in the UK's hostile environment towards immigrants, his accusation would be acted on, leading to Amma's arrest, guilty until proven innocent, in a reversal of the assumption that apparently underpins British law. Adama and Amma experience alienation enabled by racism, but Amma's story also illustrates how racism fractures the Black community too. Amma's Black neighbour has seen what's happened, but she tells Attila, I saw them but stayed out of sight. I could do nothing. Next thing you know, she shook her head again. The neighbour disassociates herself from any connection with Amma, a response shaped by her own sense of unbelonging and a fear of repercussions as she's alienated herself. Now, Fauna suggests via Attila that the events and the racism experienced by Adama, Amma and Tano do cause suffering, but they're not automatically then traumatic events that will lead to PTSD. As Krapps notes, to quote, problems that are essentially political or economic are medicalised, and the people affected by them are pathologised as victims without agency, sufferers from an illness that can be cured through psychological counselling. Happiness suggests alternatively that suffering can lead to other outcomes. For example, when Jean considers Tano's experiences of being removed from his mother, becoming homeless and then living on the streets, she has, to quote, an early sense that Attila's practicality in the matter of Tano was right, As in her world of foxes, I guess, sometimes there was no fix. Sometimes it was better just to let the thing find its own equilibrium. Tanno's brain was an ecosystem. It would reconfigure itself to survive. When Tanno runs away from the foster home he's put in following Amma's eviction, he returns to and stays in familiar territory, even though his key does not open the flat door. He feels relatively safe here, knowing how to survive in the short term, at least. Attila suggests that Tanno used his wits, but for Jean, the naturalist, this is instinctual behaviour to head home, head back to the den. And when he can't access that, to stay out of sight, stay close by, because he knows where to find food, water, shelter. And this is where he will feel safe, most secure. So although it seems chance or coincidence that Tanno is located by the group of street sweepers, traffic wardens and security guards that Jean and Attila form, Jean shows that the probability of Tanno being in the area which he considers his community is high, and that's where he's eventually discovered. Through a combination of personal survival instincts and a sense of community belonging, Tanno stays safe until he's found. So what I'm trying to sort of suggest is that the coincidence plots in Happiness, the novel, emphasize connection and community, and in turn this produces a sense of happiness, the emotion, even in circumstances of suffering and distress. Jean perhaps articulates most explicitly the revelation that happiness exists in this most unlikely circumstance of a missing child, or unlikely for Western sensibilities steeped in the PTSD model of trauma. She compares the laughter amongst the group as they search to quote, what she knew of the Americans and British. She could not imagine there being laughter in this sort of search. Jean says she has been shocked by it at first. The sound of the laughter had seemed disrespectful, but she understands its power after being threatened by a group of men in a local park at night. The rest of the group come to find her, running off the men, and as the danger passes, they laugh at the silver man, who still has his silver paint on and is glowing in the moonlight. The laughter nullifies the other men's assumption that Jean is an alienated, vulnerable, lone woman and embeds her into the group. Jean notes how, to quote, in those final minutes in the park, the laughter had dispelled the fear and proved its own worth. Now, Jean's the only white immigrant figure amongst them, but significantly, this group is formed around a common cause, which is to find Tanno, and which gives the group a purpose. It's not sort of constituted around race. Now, I've suggested in my chapter tentatively that this might be called a mega family, and it follows Dannenberg's discussion of coincidence in the Victorian novel. Dannenberg suggests that networks of coincidence and connection in the 19th century novel were influenced by both, quote, the Victorian cult of the family and of the influence of Romanticism's utopian urge to create harmonious, interconnected networks. Dannenberg uses the example of Charles Dickens' novel Martin Chuzzlewit, a novel where she says coincidence is used as a major networking strategy to interlink the novel's characters as the narrative progresses, to link the diverse cast of characters into an interconnecting group of friends and acquaintances, which constitutes a positive and celebratory Victorian megafamily. Now, obviously, the nature of the megafamily created in Happiness is very different to that imagined in the Victorian novel. However, used to describe a group of people working in cooperative and affectionate ways, the term does describe what's created through coincidence in Happiness when Jean and Attila meet, bringing together the wider connections they have made in the immigrant community, mobilised with the common cause of finding Tanno. Structurally, although Happiness has multiple timeframes and plot lines, these are drawn together through coincidence and culminate in a happy ending. Like the Victorian novels, closure is achieved here by Jean and Attila moving on from their previous marriages to start possibly a romantic relationship, and by Tanno and Amma being reunited and restored to their home. Happy endings are unusual for novels about immigration, which often end in dislocation, uncertain futures, and continuing alienation for the Black characters. Fauna's novel shows that happiness is possible even in the face of trauma. Through her coincidence plots, she underlines the importance of connections and community to survive and thrive, even when the world seems full of horror and struggle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think these three talks come together well as examples of subjectivities being expressed in texts that sort of speak back to Western notions of subjectivity, notions of trauma, notions of breastfeeding as grounding subjectivity, space being destabilized as a source of subjectivity. So I think they speak to each other well. I'd like to go through the questions in the chat. We only have about 5 minutes, but I do encourage you, if you have some questions, to pose them. The first question is to Jean. It's on Tilly Tilly. And the question is Tilly Tilly a version of a Yoruba prankster?
That's a really good idea. She could be. That the only thing that mitigates against that is that she becomes increasingly destructive, so that there's little fun. It's not so much that she's playing tricks for fun as she's playing tricks to get people to ruin them. And so as the novel goes on, she becomes not playful at all, like a trickster, but really destructive. And she in particular tries to damage and does damage the people closest to Jess, so that her interests are not in Jess's well-being. And she's if she may be playful at the start, at the beginning, at the end, she's just really a force of destruction. So yeah, the element of play and trick is not part of her, I think.
Okay, thank you, Jean. The other two questions, there's a third question. Okay, so this question is from Brendan Nichols, and it reads, thank you very much, Jean, Jenny, and Helen. A quick question out of curiosity for Jean. In your chapter on Oyeyemi, do you perhaps relate Jess Tilly Tilly's death and rebirth to West African ideas of the spirit child, the Abiku or Ugbanji, who dies and is reborn repeatedly?
Christopher Uma is a critic who talks a lot about the Abiku, and he does analyze the Icarus girl, but he sees the Abiku as not as Tilly Tilly, but as Jess. But for me, Jess may well be, Jess could easily be connected to the Abiku. It's a child that baffles its mother and hurts its mother because it keeps dying and getting reborn, and it never survives. So the poor mother's in despair. And actually, Jess's mother is often in despair because her daughter just seems really hard. Because but I don't think it applies to Tilly Tilly, because Tilly Tilly doesn't seem the primary idea. She really wants to live in a body. She doesn't want to. Her desires are different, I think, than the Abiku, who's here for a little while and then dies, and then is reborn and then dies again. So I would suggest that Brendan read Christopher Uma's article on the Icarus girl, because he really does make a good argument for Jess being the Abiku.
We are out of time. We only have 1 minute, so I want to see if Jenny or Helen has any comments, or if there's anything they'd like to expand on in what they've said, or any questions for each other.
Just really quickly, thanks for the comments in the chat from Claudine. that yes, those references are references that I'm working on. I've got so much to kind of get to in my breastfeeding projects, and at the moment I'm just trying to figure out which direction to go with it and what to do with it. So this is one of my tentative first steps towards it. But yeah, thanks very much for that. And thanks to the other papers too, which is lovely to hear about that. Lovely to hear about happiness as well. Thanks, Helen.
Final word from Helen. Helen, I do work on trauma. I was very impressed with your discussion. I wish we had more time, but anything you have to say?
Yeah, no, thank you. Like, there is a comment, and I would just to say I haven't thought of that, but I've noted it down and I'll follow it up. Yeah, no, thanks. Really nice to hear all his papers and things, and yeah. Looking forward to hearing all the next ones and getting perhaps some more discussion going. So yes, thanks to everybody. Really interesting papers.
And just a note to everyone listening in, the recordings will be saved and will be posted by Torch. Thank you all for being with us. Thanks to our panelists, and thanks to Pelagia and Torch. Please join us again February 7th for the next set of speakers. Goodbye.
Bye.
Hi, everyone. Sorry we ran out of time there at the end, and Jenny and Helen, those two questions came in for you right at the end. Didn't have time to pose them as they were presented.
Okay.
I apologize for that.
Don't worry.
No worries.
All right, I have to go teach a class. Thanks to everyone.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm going to go and grab my car before the garage closes. So see you all next time.
I will.